Welcome back to another video in our Assistive Tech Design series. Today we're talking about user testing and test plans. At some point during your product development, you'll have a prototype and you'll need to test it. Now a lot of people who are new to this idea might think, oh, I'll just bring my prototype over to my co-designer and have them use it. They'll tell me everything I need. You could do that, but that's likely not a great use of your testing period, and if you keep them doing that over several prototype iterations, then you're definitely not spending your design cycles efficiently. You need a test plan. Before we get there, let's talk more generally about what you need for user testing. In order to do user testing, things you might need include something to test, someone to test with, a test plan, a test location, results documentation. So what is a test plan? First, we go back to the iterative design process we discussed earlier and think about this particular iteration. What was the objective? What were your goals and risks? That will inform the first item in the test plan, test objectives. In this example, we might say, in this iteration of the Visionmatic 3000, we are aiming to ensure fit and comfort, not to ensure that its primary functionality of reading off street signs actually works. Second, we can start to think about this as an experiment. What are your test variables? Do you need to test in different environments, different times of day? Do you need to vary load or try a feature with multiple people? Are there other variables that you need to consider? Next, we need to think about how you're measuring results. How do you determine success or failure? Now, there are a couple different kinds of measurements we ought to consider. There are objective measurements and subjective measurements, and then there are quantitative and qualitative measurements. Generally speaking, objective measurements are impartial, repeatable measurements, while subjective measurements are thoughts and opinions, typically of the user. On a different axis, quantitative measurements involve numbers and qualitative measurements involve words or descriptions. Examples of objective quantitative measurement might be the relative size of, say, a wearable device to a user's body part, or the amount of time it takes for a user to complete a task with a product. A quick tip: you often want to do multiple trials for these measurements. Being objective doesn't mean they're always exactly the same. Also, if you're measuring body parts, you probably are not the first person to take that kind of measurement. Check how people have done it in the past and what procedures and landmarks have been used for reference. Bodies are often soft and squishy, so if you don't have a procedure beforehand, decent chance you'll get very different results across different testing days. Examples of a subjective, qualitative measurement might be a user's comments on ease of use or parts of a procedure that were confusing, or additional information about how they would or wouldn't like to use something. Be sure to make note of this information and try not to just rely on remembering everything. It can also be helpful sometimes to bring a recording device with you, but more on that later. Now, most of the time, objective measurements correspond to quantitative measurements, and subjective measurements correspond to qualitative measurements, but this isn't always the case. You might use a numerical scale to quantify a subjective response. For example, on a 5-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree, how would you rate the statement, the Visionmatic 3000 is comfortable, or the product is easy to clean, or I would wear this version over that version to school? Having a numerical scale can be very helpful, but remember that these values are subjective, and to be careful when comparing them against each other, especially across different testing sessions. Finally, it can be good to establish a point of comparison for your product. Basically, how does it compare to not having your product? In many cases, you'll have a baseline from your co-designer early on when they tell you about how they currently do an activity that presents a challenge for them, and sometimes that baseline is simply that they can't do the activity, period. But even when a descriptive baseline is provided early on, consider doing tests or asking questions to establish how your product compares to the baseline more systematically, in ways that you can directly compare to iterations of your product later on. Now let's talk about running the test. In user testing, we are testing with a person rather than testing the person, so the emphasis is on testing and improving the design of your product, not measuring the user's ability directly. One thing to consider when running the test is how you are recording the results, and whether you can realistically record the results during the test. It can be hard to take notes, for example, if you are occupied physically helping your user. A couple different types of recording methods include written notes, videos, and photos. Videos and photos in particular can be really helpful because you might notice things later on that you didn't see during the test, and you can automatically capture some of the context for the test. But when you want to use video and photos, make sure that you have permission from your co-designer first. During the test, instead of instructing your co-designer through every step of using your product, it can be helpful to ask your co-designer to perform certain actions given your product. This removes some of the preconceptions that you might have if you just walk them through, and allows your co-designer to use the product more naturally. Of course, this doesn't mean that you shouldn't provide any instruction. Just be mindful of how much help you're giving, and whether that starts to hurt your ability to learn from the test. In asking "how would you do X" questions, look for patterns in the way the product is being used. Is the co-designer always leaning to the left? Is a mouse always being used when you expected a keyboard? And so on. Patterns can help you learn more about your co-designer's preferences or limitations, or their expectations of your products based on their interactions with it. Finally, let's talk about documentation, the proof that you did your test. Some important things to consider having. Who was there? Where was the test done? Any other relevant conditions, such as if you were testing a product meant to be used at night during the day, or something meant for a wet environment in a dry one. Measurements. User comments and feedback. Your observations during or immediately after the test. Remember that pictures, videos, and audio recordings are also part of your documentation, but these are things that you should always check with your co-designer before taking. Documentation will let you go back to your design process and think through what happened during this particular iteration. It'll help you answer such questions as whether the iteration objectives were met, what other changes need to be made, or what other tests you might consider in the future. In some cases, product testing might lead you to reconsider your product design entirely, as you might find completely different approaches to solving the problem, or realize that there are roadblocks with risks that you can't deal with. I hope this gives you an idea of how user testing can work. I hope I've convinced all of you that going into a test with no plan is probably not the best idea, and that you can use your time and the time of your co-designer much more effectively if you first develop a test plan before going into testing. A final note is that you don't always need to completely adhere to your plan 100%. There can be cases where you want to or need to deviate from it for safety or comfort reasons, or to explore a new aspect that you hadn't thought of before, or other reasons. It's okay to be flexible, but it is much easier to make deviations when you are doing so from a pre-made plan than it is if you are making up the entire test plan on the spot. That's it for our overview of user testing. Good luck in your user testing!